Jack Mercer sat on the porch of his isolated cabin, staring into the vast desert that stretched endlessly before him. The late evening sky glowed with fading sunlight, casting deep purple and red hues over the sandy dunes. The desert was a place of silence, of stillness, and for Jack, it was sanctuary. After 25 years in Earth's military, fighting off-world battles and seeing things no man should, all he wanted was peace. He had earned his solitude. The only sound was the quiet hum of his solar generator and the occasional gust of wind sweeping over the sand. Jack leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, boots kicked up on the railing, and sipped from his mug of whiskey. His rifle rested nearby, more out of habit than necessity. Nothing ever happened out here. That was the point. But tonight was different. The first sign was a sudden drop in temperature. It was subtle, but enough to make Jack sit up, his senses immediately on high alert. He wasn't sure what it was, but years of combat had taught him to trust his gut. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing, but saw nothing unusual. The second sign was the hum. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then it grew louder, persistent. The sound was deep, almost mechanical, reverberating through the air. Jack stood, grabbing his rifle instinctively, his heart beginning to race. And then, the light appeared. It streaked across the sky, far too low to be a satellite or meteor. It was bright, blue-white, and it moved with impossible precision, stopping in mid-air as if deciding where to go next. Jack watched it, frozen. He had seen ships before, both human and alien, but nothing like this. This was different. The light hovered for a few seconds before descending rapidly, vanishing behind a distant dune. The hum grew louder for a moment, then stopped entirely, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Jack didn't move at first. He stood there, rifle in hand, staring at the spot where the light had disappeared. His heart pounded in his chest. Whatever had just landed wasn't from Earth. He knew that much. He cursed under his breath. Not again, he muttered, thinking back to the horrors he had witnessed during the war. This was supposed to be over. He was supposed to be done with all of this. A sudden shimmer in the air snapped him out of his thoughts. At first, it was like the heat waves that rose from the sand during the day, but it intensified, becoming a distortion, a ripple in reality itself. And then they appeared. 3 figures materialized in front of him, as if stepping through the fabric of space. They were aliens, though not like any he had seen during his time on distant battlefields. These creatures were short, about 5 feet tall, with long, thin limbs and elongated heads. Their skin shimmered with a metallic sheen, shifting colors like liquid metal in the moonlight. Their eyes large and glowing, an unnatural shade of blue fixed on him with an intensity that made Jack's skin crawl. Their suits were form-fitting, almost like armor, but more fluid, constantly changing color to blend in with their surroundings. They moved without making a sound, as if they were floating just above the ground. One of them, standing slightly ahead of the others, spoke. Its voice was mechanical, synthesized, but there was a strange, mocking tone beneath it. Jack Mercer, it said, the words oddly distorted, as if it was unfamiliar with human speech. You are required. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. I don't know who you are, or what you want, but you're not welcome here. The lead alien cocked its head, as if amused. Your cooperation is non-negotiable. Like hell it is, Jack growled, raising his rifle. He didn't care what kind of advanced tech these things had, he wasn't going down without a fight. But before he could even aim, the rifle was ripped from his hands by an invisible force. It flew across the porch, landing with a dull thud against the wall of his cabin. You won't need that, the alien said with a smug undertone. Jack's mind raced. They had disarmed him in an instant. He knew the tech these aliens possessed was beyond anything Earth had, but seeing it up close like this, in his own home, was something else. Still, Jack wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated easily. What do you want? Jack demanded, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. The alien's glowing eyes seemed to flicker for a moment. Information. What kind of information? Jack asked, already dreading the answer. Your wars, the alien replied. Your history. Your technology. Everything you have hidden, everything you've forgotten. Jack narrowed his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. The alien took a step forward, its companions remaining silent behind it. You will tell us, Jack Mercer. One way or another. Jack didn't move, but his mind was racing. He had seen enough alien interrogations during the war to know where this was heading. They weren't here to ask politely. They were here to take what they wanted. I'm not telling you a damn thing, Jack said, his voice hard. The alien's eyes flashed brighter. You misunderstand, human. We are not asking. Before Jack could react, the air around him shimmered, and an intense pressure clamped down on his skull. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, as if the aliens were trying to pry open his mind. He gritted his teeth, fighting the sensation, refusing to let them in. The pressure intensified, and Jack felt a sharp pain behind his eyes. Memories flashed in his mind, battlefields, comrades, enemies, all mixed in a chaotic swirl. He fought to block them out, focusing on the here and now, on the present. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. Jack staggered, gripping the porch railing to steady himself. His vision swam for a moment before clearing. The aliens stood where they had been, watching him, their expressions unreadable. We will return, the lead alien said, its voice colder now. Do not resist next time. The consequences will be unpleasant. With that, the three aliens shimmered again, and in an instant, they were gone, leaving Jack alone on the porch, the rifle still lying where it had been thrown. Jack stood there for a long time, breathing heavily, the night air thick with tension. The hum in the distance had faded, and the desert was quiet once again. But Jack knew this was just the beginning. Whatever they wanted, they weren't going to stop until they got it. And Jack Mercer was not a man who gave in easily. The desert sun blazed high in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked, dry earth. Jack Mercer crouched beside his solar generator, inspecting the device for the third time that day. Sweat dripped down his face, but he ignored it, his mind focused on one thing, staying off the grid. For the past few weeks, his peace had been shattered. Ever since that first encounter with the aliens, they hadn't left him alone. Every few nights, they would appear, sometimes hovering just beyond the dunes, other times right outside his cabin. The shimmering distortion that marked their presence was now a familiar, dreaded sight. Each time, they asked the same questions. Each time, Jack refused to answer. At first, the harassment was subtle. Lights flashing in the sky, strange noises in the middle of the night, electronics malfunctioning. But as the days dragged on, their methods grew more aggressive. They drained his water supply, left his crops withered under an unnatural blight, and disabled his solar panels, plunging him into darkness. They were trying to wear him down. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, tightening the last bolt on the panel. As he stood, the familiar hum echoed through the air, faint but growing louder. His heart sank. They were back. He straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. It wasn't much, but it was something. He knew it was useless against their tech, but holding it gave him a small sense of control, even if it was an illusion. The air shimmered once again, and three figures materialized in front of him. This time, there was no pretense of politeness. "You're becoming tiresome, human," one of the aliens said, its voice cold and mechanical. Its eyes glowed brighter than usual, like twin blue flames in the afternoon heat. "We have been more than patient." Jack's jaw clenched. He stepped forward, his hand still hovering over his revolver. "You can keep coming back all you want," he growled. "You're not getting anything from me." The lead alien tilted its head, the gesture slow and deliberate. "Is that what you believe?" The second alien raised its arm, and the familiar device on its wrist began to hum. Jack tensed, knowing what was coming, but not fast enough to stop it. A pulse of energy rippled through the air, striking him with an invisible force. His vision blurred, and the ground seemed to sway beneath his feet. Suddenly, the hum grew deafening, and Jack fell to his knees, clutching his head. It wasn't pain, at least, not in the conventional sense. It was something deeper, more primal, as though the very core of his mind was being attacked. The sensation was like ice spreading through his skull, numbing his thoughts. He fought it, biting down on the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood, using the sharp pain to anchor himself. But the pressure didn't stop. Images flickered in his mind, memories of the war, memories he had buried. Friends lost, battles fought, the smell of burning metal, and the endless, empty silence of space. The aliens were sifting through his mind like it was a collection of old files, searching for something he didn't understand. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pressure released. Jack collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His body trembled from the effort of resisting their intrusion. He could still feel the remnants of their probing, like phantom fingers in his brain. The lead alien stepped closer, its mechanical voice vibrating with cold malice. "We can take what we want, Jack Mercer. You are mistaken if you think this is a negotiation." Jack forced himself to his feet, staggering slightly but managing to stand. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, but his eyes were locked on the alien. "You don't get to break me," he spat. "I've been through worse." The alien said nothing for a moment, its glowing eyes narrowing, studying him. Then it stepped back, folding its long, spindly arms. "We are beginning to understand why they kept you hidden." Jack frowned, wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth. "What are you talking about? Do you really believe you were just a soldier?" The alien's voice was quieter now, almost condescending. "Your kind is known for hiding its weapons in plain sight. You are one such weapon." Jack's mind raced. He didn't know what they were talking about. He had been a soldier, nothing more. Sure, he'd been part of some classified missions, some off-world operations that didn't make the history books, but that was it. He wasn't special. He wasn't. His thoughts were interrupted as the alien's voice took on a harsher edge. "We have scanned your records, your history. There are gaps. Large ones. Do you not remember? Or have they erased it from you?" Jack's skin went cold. He had memories of the war, of course he did. But the more he thought about it, the more fragmented they seemed. Certain years were hazy, details missing. He'd always chalked it up to trauma, to the brain protecting itself from things too horrible to remember. But now, he wasn't so sure. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. The lead alien's eyes glowed brighter, its gaze piercing. "You will. And when you do, you will cooperate." The air shimmered again, and just like that, they were gone. That night, Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring down at an untouched meal. His hands shook slightly, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push the alien's words out of his mind. They had seen something in him, something even he didn't understand. He rubbed his temples, feeling the dull ache left behind from their psychic attack. His thoughts drifted back to his military service, to the classified missions he had undertaken. There were gaps, sure. But that wasn't unusual for someone who had seen the kind of combat he had. Or was it? He stood up abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. It was the first time in years that he had felt truly out of control. The aliens weren't just tormenting him, they were digging for something. Information, memory, something buried deep within him. And whatever it was, they were willing to push him to the breaking point to get it. Suddenly, the lights in the cabin flickered and went out. Jack froze, the darkness pressing in around him. Then, through the window, he saw it, the familiar glow of blue-white light on the horizon. The aliens were back. But this time, something was different. The glow was brighter, more intense. The hum was louder, almost overwhelming. Jack grabbed his revolver, knowing it was a futile gesture but unwilling to face them unarmed. He stepped outside onto the porch, his eyes scanning the sky. The light wasn't hovering this time. It was rising, no, growing. It looked like a storm cloud, but it was made of pure energy, swirling and crackling with power. Then, out of the light, a new figure emerged. Taller than the others, this alien radiated authority. Its armor was sleek, black, and its glowing blue eyes burned with cold malice. It hovered above the ground, suspended by some invisible force, and as it approached, the air around Jack grew heavy, almost oppressive. This one was different. It wasn't here to ask questions. It was here to take. "We are growing tired of your resistance," it said, its voice deeper, more resonant than the others. It didn't bother with the usual threats or posturing. It was a statement of fact, a warning. Jack stood his ground, gripping his revolver tightly. "And I'm tired of you," he shot back. But even as he said it, he knew the words were hollow. The alien raised its arm, and a wave of force slammed into Jack. He was thrown back against the porch railing, the breath knocked from his lungs. The revolver flew from his hand, skittering across the ground. "You will not resist again," the alien intoned. Its eyes burned brighter, and suddenly, Jack felt something he hadn't felt before. Fear. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. The alien was done playing, and Jack knew that if he didn't act soon, they would break him. They would take everything. Jack sat in the dark, the oppressive weight of the alien's final words hanging over him like a storm cloud. His body ached from being slammed into the porch railing, and every breath came with a sharp sting. But the physical pain wasn't what gnawed at him. It was the fear, the growing sense that these aliens were more than just a threat, they were unstoppable. And worse, they were prying at something deep within him, something he couldn't even comprehend. The cabin was pitch black, save for the faint glow of starlight filtering through the dusty windows. The power had gone out again, another sabotage by his tormentors. Jack sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the shadows, his mind racing. He had fought hard to stay off the radar after the war, to live out his life in peace, but these creatures had found him. And they weren't going to leave until they got what they wanted. The alien's words echoed in his head. "You are one such weapon." Weapon? Jack had always thought of himself as a soldier, nothing more. He had been part of classified missions, sure, but the idea that he was some sort of hidden asset made no sense. What could they possibly be after? Why him? In his mind, he cycled through the missions he'd been on, trying to recall every detail. There were gaps, years that seemed blurred, memories that faded when he tried to focus on them. He had always chalked it up to trauma or fatigue, things all veterans dealt with. But now he wasn't so sure. What if they were right? What if something had been done to him during those Black Ops missions? He didn't trust the higher-ups who had sent him to fight alien threats, and now it seemed they had buried something deep inside his mind. Something that these aliens were hell-bent on uncovering. Jack stood up, his legs shaky, and crossed the small room to the far corner where a loose floorboard creaked under his boot. He crouched down, prying it up with practiced precision. Beneath it lay a small metal box, covered in dust. Inside was the last thing he wanted to use, an artifact from the war he had vowed to leave behind. His hand hovered over the box for a moment before he opened it, revealing a small, sleek device, alien in design, though he had no idea which species had made it. He had found it during one of his covert operations on a distant moon, buried deep in the ruins of a long-forgotten alien civilization. They had called it the Key, though no one knew exactly what it was. Some of the men Jack had served with believed it was a relic, a piece of ancient tech that could summon something. What? No one was sure. Others thought it was a weapon, one of unimaginable power. No one had dared use it. In fact, no one had even been able to activate it. But the rumors had persisted, dark whispers that it could call forth beings older than the stars themselves. Jack had kept it hidden all these years, partly out of curiosity, partly out of a deep, unsettling instinct that it might one day be his last option. That day had come. His fingers brushed over the smooth, metallic surface of the device. It was small, no bigger than his palm, but it radiated a cold energy. Jack could feel it, even without turning it on. He had never tested it, had never wanted to. But now, with the aliens pressing him from every side, with their psychic invasions getting closer and closer to breaking him, he knew he had no other choice. The alternative was to let them tear him apart piece by piece until they found what they were looking for inside his mind. He stood up, the device in hand, and walked back to the table. His mind was a whirlwind of doubt. What if this thing doesn't work? Worse yet, what if it works too well? For a moment, he hesitated. He stared down at the device, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. This was at the point of no return. If he activated this, there was no going back. But then again, what future did he have if he didn't? Jack exhaled slowly and pressed the small, circular button at the device's center. Nothing happened at first. The room remained quiet, the shadows unmoving. Jack frowned, turning the device over in his hands, wondering if it had simply been a useless piece of junk all along. But then, the air around him shifted. The temperature in the cabin dropped sharply, a sudden chill that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand up. The shadows deepened, and the silence in the room grew oppressive. It was as though the very fabric of reality had stretched, bent, and twisted. Jack's breath caught in his throat. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and deep within his chest. The stars outside the window flickered, dimming, and then a new presence made itself known. It wasn't the aliens. Jack could feel that instinctively. No, this was something far older, something far more dangerous. The entity wasn't here yet, but Jack could sense it just beyond the veil of reality, waiting, watching. And then the aliens arrived. The shimmering distortion appeared outside his window, and the blue-white light cast long, eerie shadows across the room. They had sensed the activation of the device. Jack could hear the low hum of their ship, hovering just beyond the dunes, but this time they didn't waste time with warnings or demands. They appeared in an instant, 5 of them, including the tall one he had seen before. The leader stepped forward, eyes blazing with anger. "What have you done, human?" Jack didn't respond. He simply held the device in his hand, staring down at it as if it were the key to his salvation or his destruction. "You have no idea what you've summoned," the alien leader hissed, its mechanical voice trembling with something Jack hadn't heard before: fear. "Turn it off. Now." But Jack couldn't turn it off. He wasn't even sure how. The hum was growing louder, and the air in the cabin felt thick, as if something was pressing down from all sides. The alien raised its arm, and Jack felt the familiar pulse of energy building, ready to strike. But before it could release the attack, the ground trembled. A deep, earth-shaking rumble reverberated through the desert, and the sky outside the window darkened, as though the stars themselves were being swallowed by a vast, unseen force. The aliens froze. The leader's eyes flickered, and for the first time since their arrival, Jack saw something he hadn't expected: panic. "No, it's too late," the alien muttered, its voice barely a whisper. "You've called it." A blinding flash of light burst from the horizon, and Jack shielded his eyes. When he looked again, the sky had torn open. A massive rift, blacker than the void of space, stretched across the heavens, crackling with energy. Through the rift, something was emerging. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't even a creature in any form Jack could understand. It was an entity, a mass of swirling shadows and light, too vast and incomprehensible to be fully seen. Tendrils of energy stretched out from it, curling and twisting through the air like the arms of a cosmic god. The aliens recoiled, their metallic suits flickering with static as they tried to escape. But they were too late. The entity's presence washed over them, and Jack watched in stunned silence as the aliens were enveloped in a wave of dark energy. Their screams echoed through the desert, distorted and broken, before they were swallowed entirely. The leader turned to Jack, its eyes wide, desperate. "You fool," it shrieked. "You've doomed us all." And then it, too, was consumed, vanishing into the darkness. Jack stood alone, the entity now hovering above the desert, a force beyond anything he had ever seen or imagined. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply waited. Jack felt its gaze, though it had no eyes. It was as if the universe itself had turned its attention to him. He had no idea what he had called, no idea what kind of power he had unleashed. But one thing was certain. The aliens were right. He was a weapon. But not in the way they had thought. For what he had summoned was far more dangerous than anything Jack or the aliens could have imagined. And now, as the entity slowly faded back into the rift, Jack was left alone, holding the key in his hand, wondering how long it would be before it came back. And what it would want next time. The desert was still again, but the silence felt wrong, like the calm after a storm that had only just begun. Jack Mercer stood frozen on the porch of his cabin, staring at the sky where the rift had just torn through reality, where the entity had emerged and then vanished just as quickly. The cold metal device the key felt heavier in his hand than ever before. The aliens were gone, erased by whatever he had summoned. Their screams still echoed in his mind, chilling him to the bone. They had warned him, begged him even, but Jack had gone too far. Now, he was standing in the aftermath of a power so vast it defied understanding. A power that had come. And gone. But why had it spared him? Jack's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the steps of the porch, his heart still racing. The air felt thick with a tension he couldn't shake, as if the universe itself was watching him. He glanced down at the device in his hand. The key. What the hell had he called? The rumble of his old truck's engine broke the silence. Jack had been using it to try and stay off the grid, but the truck had been dead for days, another casualty of the aliens' harassment. He spun around, looking at the driveway, and sure enough, the engine roared to life on its own. The headlights flickered, bathing the desert in an eerie glow. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, shaking his head. "This is wrong. This isn't over." He stood, forcing himself to move, and rushed into the cabin. The air inside was thick, heavy with a presence he couldn't see. His skin crawled as he moved through the dark room. The power was still out, but his old satellite phone sat in its usual place on the shelf by the kitchen. It was his last link to anyone outside this isolated stretch of desert. He hadn't used it in years. Jack grabbed the phone and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, but there were no signals, no networks to connect to. Just static. He punched in a number anyway, one he hadn't dialed in over a decade. One from deep in his military days. The kind of number that led to people with real power, people who dealt with things like this. The kind of people he had sworn never to contact again. The line clicked, and for a second, he thought he had misdialed, that the number had long since been decommissioned. But then, after a long pause, a voice came through, cool and professional. "Mercer." The sound of his name on that line made Jack's blood run cold. They already knew it was him. There was no greeting, no question of who was calling. They had been waiting. Watching. "It's Jack Mercer," he replied, his voice hoarse from the tension in his throat. "Yes," the voice said, emotionless. "We know. You've activated it." Jack swallowed hard. He knew who he was talking to, an unnamed section of Earth's defense operations, a shadowy division that handled threats the public would never hear about. The kind of people who buried the truth under layers of classified reports, who had sent him on those uncharted missions that had clearly been more than just combat tours. "What the hell did I just do?" Jack asked, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He paced the small space of his cabin, eyes darting nervously toward the windows, half expecting the sky to split open again. The line was silent for a moment, and then the voice responded, careful and controlled. "You've summoned an observer." "An observer?" Jack repeated, feeling a chill run down his spine. "What the hell is that?" "Something that watches, Mercer. Something older than any species we've ever encountered. We don't know exactly what they are, but we know what they can do." Jack's heart hammered in his chest. It wiped those aliens out like they were nothing. What was it looking for? Another pause. It wasn't looking for anything. It was listening. Jack's mind raced, trying to comprehend the implications. He had unleashed something so ancient and powerful that even the aliens who had been terrorizing him were terrified of it. And all it had done was listen. "What's it listening for?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know. And we don't want to find out. The key you activated is one of a handful we recovered from the ruins of alien worlds, places that were wiped clean of life before our time. We don't know what the observers are, only that when one arrives, it means something is happening. A change. A shift." Jack swallowed, fear clawing at him. "Then why the hell did you give me this thing?" "We didn't," the voice responded calmly. "You found it. You brought it back. You were part of an experiment to see if humans could withstand prolonged exposure to alien technology. The results were inconclusive." "Inconclusive?" Jack's temper flared. That thing was buried deep in my mind, and these aliens were trying to rip it out. You knew they were coming for it. We suspected, the voice admitted. But we didn't think they would find you. We underestimated them. Clearly, they wanted the key for their own reasons. Jack's head spun. "So, now what? What happens to me?" There was another long silence, and Jack's pulse quickened. He had been through enough to know when he was being written off. "We suggest you leave," the voice said finally. "Go as far off the grid as possible. The observer didn't destroy you. That means it saw something of interest. We don't know why. We can't guarantee it won't return." "That's it?" Jack's voice rose, anger and fear boiling over. "You're just going to let me fend for myself? You're not a civilian anymore, Mercer. You never were. You're an asset, and like all assets, you've outlived your usefulness. We'll monitor the situation, but this is beyond any of us now." The line went dead. Jack stood there, the phone still in his hand, his mind a blur of rage and disbelief. They had left him to face whatever this was on his own. They had known about the key, about the observer, and they had let him carry it around like a ticking time bomb. He tossed the phone onto the table, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The cabin felt suffocating now, the walls closing in. He could still feel the presence of the entity, even though it had vanished from sight. It had watched him, judged him, and for reasons unknown, it had let him live. But how long would that mercy last? Jack stood at the edge of his porch, looking out into the desert. The sky was clear now, the stars twinkling above, but they felt different. Distant. Like they were hiding something far darker beyond their light. He knew he couldn't stay here. The military had made that clear. The aliens might be gone, but something worse had been set in motion. The observer might return. And if it did, Jack doubted he would be as lucky next time. His fingers tightened around the key, the small device that had brought so much chaos into his life. He couldn't destroy it, didn't know how. But he couldn't keep it either. It was a beacon for forces far beyond his understanding. As he turned to pack what little he had, Jack realized that the war he thought he'd left behind was far from over. The battlefield had changed, the enemies more mysterious, more powerful, but one thing remained the same. Jack Mercer would survive. He had no other choice. And whatever was coming, whatever dark, ancient forces were now watching him, he would be ready.